Something subtle begins long before anyone recognizes it. A faint disturbance grows inside, almost imperceptible at first, as if an inner structure starts loosening without warning. Daily routines continue unchanged, familiar surroundings remain intact, yet an invisible tension spreads beneath the surface. The life once carried with confidence suddenly feels mismatched, as though it belonged to someone else. A quiet unease expands gradually, signaling the first rupture within the psyche. Carl Jung described this moment as the soft collapse of the fabricated identity. The carefully assembled exterior, crafted to meet expectations, begins to lose its hold. You try to dismiss the shift, fatigue, impatience, overthinking, but none of those explanations land. Something older, deeper, instinctive is pushing upward. This inner movement isn't attempting to destroy your world. It's trying to expose what no longer aligns with your essence. What follows feels like an internal quake. Desires fade. Motivations weaken. Ambitions once pursued with conviction now seem hollow. People who once felt close begin to sound distant, almost foreign. The most unsettling part is recognizing your own reflection and sensing a stranger behind your eyes. You haven't failed. You've outgrown a role built for survival. This initial break, the first stage, dismantles false certainty. It strips away inherited narratives, cultural scripts, and protective patterns. It reveals how much of your daily life was constructed around pleasing, performing, maintaining harmony, avoiding rejection. The fracture inside shows where authenticity has been buried. It is not chaos for the sake of chaos. It is the soul refusing confinement. And then the second stage arrives, far more intense than the first. The collapse that begins quietly becomes total. The internal identity, shaped by childhood fears, social conditioning and the desire for belonging, loses stability. The persona that once gave you direction cannot hold itself together anymore. What you previously defended so fiercely slips through your fingers. This unraveling feels like an interior disintegration. Not physical death, but the end of the character you believed yourself to be. Old ambitions no longer ignite anything. Emotional reactions seem disconnected from your intentions. Words leave your mouth but feel detached from your truth. The structure that once organized your inner world dissolves into fragments. The ego reacts with desperation. It warns you that you're falling apart, insists that something disastrous is happening, demands that you cling to familiar habits. Nighttime becomes restless. Thoughts race. Feelings surge without warning. A strange sense of detachment grows, as if watching your own life from a distance. Yet underneath the panic sits a quiet clarity you can't deny. Jung referred to this psychic dissolution as a symbolic dismemberment, a psychological stripping away of everything false. The identity that previously held authority can no longer control the narrative. Years of protective mechanisms, people-pleasing, perfectionism, emotional suppression, persistent self-criticism, lose their power. The defenses grown to ensure acceptance finally collapse under their own weight. What feels like confusion is actually liberation in its earliest form. You begin to realize that the voice shouting warnings is the same voice that kept you locked in outdated patterns. The panic isn't truth. It's resistance. Beneath the fear, a new awareness flickers, one that senses the possibility of living without pretenses. During this descent, distractions fail. Old comforts feel dull. Coping behaviors no longer numb the discomfort. The dissolution continues regardless of attempts to stop it. Feeling lost is evidence that the constructed identity has loosened enough for something more genuine to emerge. The most surprising realization comes when the noise settles for a moment. Something within you remains untouched. Not the protective persona, not the anxious mind, but a deeper presence that has waited patiently beneath years of conditioning. This enduring presence doesn't panic. It observes. It knows the collapse isn't annihilation. It is purification. The early stages of awakening strip away illusions so that truth can finally breathe. The foundation is gone, yet something real is beginning to form beneath the rubble. A strange quiet settles in after the inner collapse, not comforting and not peaceful, but hollow. You move through your days almost mechanically, performing tasks that once held meaning yet now feel detached from who you are. The world around you hasn't changed, but you no longer sense yourself inside it the same way. Faces, conversations, routines, everything carries a faint distance, as though your presence has become translucent. This disconnection is not failure. It is the beginning of exile. Exile is the moment when the psyche withdraws its energy from old places. The former identity cannot return, yet the emerging one hasn't taken shape, leaving you suspended between two worlds. The people you interacted with regularly feel slightly out of sync. Activities that once grounded you fall flat. You speak, respond, act, but your inner voice observes quietly, noticing how those actions no longer match your truth. It's not sadness, not apathy. Something deeper, a state where the fabric of your former life loosens thread by thread. This stage feels like drifting. You're present, yet not anchored. Emotional resonance fades. You look at familiar settings and sense that you've stepped outside your own story. Jung described this condition as a withdrawal of libido from previous attachments. The psyche stops investing in the structures that supported the old self, not because they are harmful, but because they belong to a chapter that has ended. The most painful part is losing access to the self who once navigated life effortlessly. The version of you who knew which dreams to chase, which paths to follow, which ambitions to nurture, that version feels unreachable. You try to force old patterns to return, but something inside you refuses. It knows that returning would mean shrinking, bending, compromising. Exile is not rejection from the world. It is the refusal of your soul to continue living inside a narrative too small for its truth. And then the psyche pulls inward even more. Exile becomes deeper silence, and that silence forms the cocoon. Social engagement becomes exhausting. Noise feels abrasive. Distractions that once offered relief now feel like burdens. Solitude becomes the only environment where your system can breathe. This isolation is not self-punishment. It is reconstruction. Inside the cocoon, everything internal rises to the surface. Old disappointments, unprocessed grief, forgotten memories, abandoned aspirations. Layers of the inner world you avoided for years begin demanding attention. Without the persona's mask, raw emotion emerges with full intensity. The cocoon forces complete honesty. Nothing can be pushed away anymore. Jung spoke of this inward redirection as the psyche reclaiming its energy to initiate transformation. The cocoon functions exactly like that. It strips away distractions so the deeper layers of your being can reveal themselves. You start seeing your patterns clearly. Choices made from fear, relationships pursued from insecurity, habits designed to keep you invisible or agreeable. The recognition is painful but clarifying. Inside this compressed stillness, identity dissolves further. You feel fragile, sensitive, easily overwhelmed, and yet, paradoxically, closer to your authentic center than ever before. The cocoon doesn't ask you to act. It asks you to witness. It shows you what must be released long before rebirth can begin. When solitude deepens and the outer world fades into a distant hum, something long buried begins to rise from within. Not chaos, not confusion, but a presence you've spent years pushing aside. It emerges gradually, carried by emotion, memory, and instinct. This presence is the shadow, the constellation of traits, impulses, and truths you hid to remain acceptable. Everything you dismissed as unworthy, inappropriate, or inconvenient gathers in this hidden realm, waiting for the moment when you can finally meet it without flinching. The shadow doesn't approach gently. It reveals itself through sudden irritation, unexpected jealousy, sharp reactions, lingering sadness, or a wave of loneliness that appears without warning. These signals expose the parts of you that were silenced early in life. The anger denied, the longing dismissed, the passion suppressed, the boundaries ignored. Instead of attacking you, these reactions point toward truths you were trained to avoid. The discomfort is not punishment. It is communication. Inside this inner chamber, the shadow shows you where you've betrayed yourself. You recognize the moments you said yes when you wanted to say no, the choices made out of fear rather than conviction, the relationships maintained out of habit, the opportunities rejected because you believed you weren't worthy. Each realization pierces, yet also clarifies. The hidden self never sought to harm you. It protected the integrity you abandoned to survive. Jung described the shadow as the repository of everything you refused to acknowledge. But within those rejected pieces lies authenticity, instinct, courage, and power. When you stop running, when distractions lose their grip, when the persona no longer shields you, the shadow becomes a guide rather than an adversary. You begin to understand the meaning behind each trigger. Anger signals a boundary trespassed. Envy points toward a desire you've denied. Sadness reveals a longing ignored. Fear highlights the space where growth is calling. This stage is confronting, demanding, raw, but it is also the first time you see yourself without distortion. You meet your abandoned emotions not as enemies but as companions who waited patiently for your attention. The shadow's task is not to destroy you. It is to return you to wholeness. Facing it strips away illusions, exposing the depth you've avoided. And this honesty prepares you for the next threshold, the void. Once the shadow has been acknowledged, the psyche enters a different landscape. The emotional storms quiet. The internal noise softens. The confusion that once surged through your system dissipates. But what replaces it is not clarity. It is emptiness. The void is not darkness. Darkness holds texture, shape, sensation. The void contains none of that. It is open space, vast, silent, unformed. The ambitions you once held no longer inspire you. The roles you played feel distant. Old desires vanish. Even your inner conflicts lose their intensity. You wake, move, breathe, and nothing pulls you forward or backward. The absence of drive feels unsettling because the identity that depended on reaction is gone. This stage is often mistaken for apathy, stagnation, or failure. Yet it represents a deeper shift. The dissolution of the self that was built from conditioning. The psyche is not malfunctioning. It is recalibrating. In earlier stages, the structure crumbled. Here, the field where the new structure will emerge is being cleared. Jung referenced similar phases as psychological winters, periods where the inner world withdraws from outer engagement to allow regeneration. In this quiet expanse, you cannot force progress. You cannot invent direction. You cannot manufacture purpose. Effort only creates resistance. The void demands stillness, not action. Time feels strange here. Days stretch. Minutes shorten. Nothing seems urgent. Nothing seems appealing. This absence of movement is not a dead end but an incubation. You are no longer driven by the needs of the former self, yet the new self has not taken form. It is a sacred pause, a silent gestation. What makes this stage challenging is the surrender it requires. Without external validation, without inner certainty, without familiar goals, you must lean into trust. Trust that something is forming beneath the emptiness. Trust that the process has intelligence beyond your understanding. The void is the womb where the future self is conceived. Slowly, after an unknown span, a faint spark begins to glow beneath the stillness. A subtle feeling of possibility. A quiet shift in the chest. A soft instinct rising from the depths. This is the earliest sign that the void has served its purpose and the next transformation approaches. A faint inner movement emerges after the long stretch of emptiness, subtle enough to be missed if you aren't attentive. It feels like a small current stirring beneath still waters, a quiet pulse signaling that something new has begun forming inside places hollowed out by loss, silence, and surrender. Rebirth never arrives with spectacle. It comes as a gentle return of sensation, a breath that expands more naturally, a moment of presence that feels grounded rather than forced, a whisper of direction rising without pressure. This fresh current doesn't resemble motivation from the past. It doesn't push. It doesn't demand accomplishments. It doesn't try to resurrect the structures dissolved during the collapse. Instead, it carries an inner certainty that doesn't need justification. It feels like meeting yourself again after a long absence, discovering that the core beneath your conditioning has been waiting for the noise to subside. Rebirth summons qualities previously overshadowed by fear and performance. You notice color returning to ordinary moments. A walk outside touches something meaningful. A conversation resonates in a deeper way. Food tastes clearer. Your breath feels more natural. These small shifts reveal that the psyche has begun reassembling from a more authentic center. Jung spoke of a deeper organizing principle within the psyche, one that emerges only when the outdated persona releases its grip. That center begins to rise now, not as a mask, but as the foundation of a truer identity. During this stage, awareness widens. You start recognizing the hidden wisdom behind earlier pain. You understand why certain connections faded, why particular ambitions dissolved, why long-held patterns collapsed. Nothing was random. Every emotional storm, every lonely night, every uncomfortable realization carved space for something genuine to take root. Compassion begins to replace self-judgment. The past no longer feels like a burden but becomes a teacher offering understanding. Rebirth doesn't eliminate vulnerability. Some days bring clarity, others bring confusion. But even in uncertainty, there is an inner steadiness that didn't exist before. You no longer rush to escape discomfort. You sit with it, sensing its message rather than resisting it. You no longer chase validation. You choose truth. You no longer abandon your intuition. You listen with reverence. As this emerging self grows stronger, it begins shaping how you speak, choose, move, and perceive. Life no longer revolves around fitting into expectations. You start choosing environments that honor your depth. You say no when necessary without guilt. You say yes when something aligns with your inner compass. You treat your needs as sacred instead of inconvenient. This reorientation marks the beginning of embodiment. Embodiment is the moment when inner transformation becomes visible through action. Quietly, naturally, without performance. You no longer imitate awakening. You live it. You interact with the world from a place of centered awareness rather than protective reflex. You express compassion without self-erasure. You uphold boundaries through clarity rather than aggression. You acknowledge emotion without drowning in it. You engage relationships from fullness instead of longing. People around you may sense this change without understanding it. Some feel comforted by your groundedness. Others pull away because your clarity exposes their illusions. Neither reaction influences your sense of self anymore. You no longer reshape your identity to avoid discomfort. You stand in your truth with quiet confidence. Embodiment transforms creativity. Ideas flow without strain. Inspiration moves freely because you're no longer obstructed by fear of judgment. You create from authenticity, not ambition. You engage work from alignment, not pressure. You act from purpose, not compulsion. This stage also alters your relationship with solitude. Instead of fearing quiet moments, you welcome them as nourishment. Silence becomes a companion rather than an enemy. Stillness becomes a source of strength rather than a void to escape. Your inner world feels spacious, steady, intentional. What makes embodiment sacred is its subtlety. It doesn't manifest as perfection. It manifests as presence. A slow breath before responding. A gentle refusal when something violates your integrity. A soft release of what no longer resonates. A calm acceptance of what cannot be controlled. A willingness to honor your truth even when others misunderstand. This steady alignment signals that wholeness has begun rooting itself throughout your life. You survive the rupture, the collapse, the exile, the isolation, the confrontation with the hidden self, the vast emptiness, and the fragile beginning of renewal. Now you move with a quieter strength. One that doesn't need recognition because it originates from the soul rather than the persona. You are not returning to who you were. You are stepping into who you always were beneath the noise. Your awakening wasn't about becoming extraordinary. It was about becoming real. Fully, sincerely, unapologetically real. If this message resonated with your inner journey, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share a reflection about your own experience or an insight that surfaced while listening.